Hi, my name is Dana Rieske. I was born and raised here in Euharlee, and I am the manager of the Euharlee Welcome Center and History Museum and the Farmers Market. I was raised out in the Euharlee and Taylorsville area my whole life, and my family has been here for 170 plus years. I've always had an interest in history, even though that is not my background. People are my background, human services, and I just love our community. My interest in this subject came from, one, a love of history, and two, this connection with people in our community that I just found it so sad and disturbing at the same time that, like with the Pioneer Cemetery, that there was hundreds of people there that we had lost their names, we'd lost their histories, and their families have no idea where they're from or where their family is buried or laid to rest. And for myself personally, I know how interesting my family history is. It grounds me. It literally gives me roots here in Bartow County. And even if you're not from Bartow County, I think having that knowledge of where your family and your people are from and the communities that they were involved with is extremely important, because in today's society, we just don't have those roots anymore. And I wanted to work towards giving back some of the African American community members that are my friends and my neighbors and my classmates I went to school with. I wanted to give them back their history and their heritage and bring honor and glory to the ones that have been nameless for so long. I think the most interesting thing that I found is just the interconnections in our community. Finding the stories of the individuals and the families is amazing. I love being able to pass that information along to them. But I love seeing the web of people's lives and where they go in our community, and how, even though some of those connections have been lost and we're restoring them, people have no idea just how connected they are in your community. When people come out to Euharlee, they'll tell me all the time, they're like, well, I don't have any roots here, I don't have any ties here, we're just visiting. And I always jokingly tell them, give me an hour and I will find your ties to Euharlee, or at least to Bartow County. And to me, as I mentioned before, that having those connections and those roots are extremely important for grounding people. And so building this giant family tree and these records of Euharlee and Bartow County is the most amazing and interesting thing when you can look at the dynamics of it all.
Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon. Or good noon, right? It's not after yet. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's February Lunch and Learn. We're glad to have you all out this beautiful day? I don't know. Cold, wet day. Before we get started, let me give a couple of upcoming announcements. Next Thursday night will be our next evening lecture. Gloria Calhoun will be here. She is a historian of Summerhill history and is going to share that with us, with her family connections to the Summerhill community. Looking forward to having her. In March, our Lunch and Learn will be on March the 19th. That's Wednesday afternoon. Jeff Bishop, who is the director of the Funk Heritage Center over in Mollusca at Reinhardt, will be here. He's going to talk about Fort Means, which was a Cherokee Trail of Tears fort. And then on March 27th, that's our evening lecture in March, Thursday, we'll open up our newest temporary exhibit on the other side of this wall. It's called 175 Years, 175 Objects, to coincide with the city of Cartersville's 175th anniversary. All that information you can find on our website or on our social media. And if you're not a member, I encourage you to become a member, and you'll get all that in your inbox as well. All right, we'll get started now with our main event. We're pleased to welcome today our speaker, Dana Rieske. Am I spelling that right?
Yes.
Who is the manager and researcher of the Euharlee Welcome Center and History Museum. Most of you know Dana, but I'm going to read this anyway because it's a great little look into who Dana is. Dana became the manager of the Euharlee Welcome Center and History Museum in July of 2023 bringing with her a deep passion for history and community service. A longtime research volunteer for the museum, Dana has strong roots in Euharlee, tracing back to the town's founding, which fuels her dedication to preserving its history. I don't think she was here at the town's founding, but her roots go back. With a background in human services, Dana is a strong advocate for vulnerable populations. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Human Services, Criminal Justice, and Business Administration from Shorter University. In addition to her museum role, Dana is a certified agricultural literacy educator through the National Center for Agricultural Literacy and works with the Euharlee Grow-Getters, inspiring the next generation to engage with agriculture and sustainability. Beyond her work in education and history, Dana manages the Euharlee Farmers Market and collaborates closely with the Euharlee Historical Society to support local historical initiatives. A devoted wife and mother of two, she is committed to both her family and her community. So not only are we glad to have Dana here, her family is here as well to cheer her on.
Yes.
Please join me in welcoming Dana Rieske.
Thank you. And as if you've ever heard me speak before, I always have to say this is not my forte, the public speaking, so y'all have to be patient with me because sometimes I can get a little long-winded when it comes to history, which can be a good thing if you're into history yourself, which I assume that you are since y'all are here to hear about Euharlee's history. So our project and what I'm speaking about today is named Nameless No More. And if you know anything about the Euharlee history, you will know that the African American history in Euharlee has been very limited, the information that we have there, which is true of many locations throughout the United States because of the limitation of records. So we have started looking for alternative places to look for this information to identify the individuals that helped with the founding of our community out in Euharlee. And not just Euharlee, but it feeds out into Bartow County and the state of Georgia. Let's see if this is going to work. So to be nameless no more to me is to reclaim the history and to honor the memory and give voice to those who came before us. For those that aren't as familiar with the history in Euharlee, I'm going to do a brief overview of some of the major known history that we have been able to tell about in the past. And the reason we're highlighting that is not just for the people who are new to the history, but also to point out, as we get further along in the presentation, some of the corrections and things that are going to be made. This is actually the first time some of this information is being released to the public. But that's basically what I just said. So we're going to do a review of the known Euharlee history, an explanation about the importance of continuing to research. The two main people that we're going to focus on today is going to be Het Powell Sproul, which most of the time people know her as Het Powell. We've always spoke about her as Het Powell, but I'll go into further detail later about why we now know her as Het Powell Sproul. We're going to speak about an individual named Millie Taylor. What we're going to do with this new information that we have moving forward and our sources. So most of our known history that people really know us for is our covered bridge in Washington King and the Black Pioneer Cemetery in Het Powell. Our Euharlee covered bridge, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the most famous things down in Euharlee. We are known as the Covered Bridge City. It was built by Washington King, who was a free man of color. He was actually of African American, indigenous, and European descent. His father was formerly enslaved man named Horace King, and his mother was a free woman of color. The King family themselves, which if you've never heard of the history of the King family, it is fascinating. We've had several lectures about the King family. There's one in particular that we had this past summer. It's called, I lost the name of it. Anyways, it's about the King family. I apologize. It will come back to me and I will tell y'all about it in a bit. For a long time, our covered bridge was thought to have been built by by Horace King. And we have found recently, in the past 10 years, that it was actually built by Washington, his son. The King family has a great legacy throughout the South as being an African American family that were known for their architectural skills, and they're building our covered bridge, the covered bridge down at Stone Mountain. Horace King has actually been given credit for the spiral staircase that is in the Alabama State Capitol. LaGrange was their home base down there, and there's several buildings that are still built by the King family down there. But Washington King was able to come to Euharlee after several incarnations of our bridge were destroyed, and built a bridge that actually lasted in Euharlee. As you can see, it was built in 1886 and it still stands today. And part of it is due to his amazing building skills. He knew what he was doing, and the design that the King family became known for using, which was the lattice work inside of our bridge. It is the crisscross of the cords that helps reinforce the structure. And if you ever come by the museum or walk the bridge, you will see it looks like pegs, and those were called tree nails, and it's two 2-foot long wooden pegs basically, and that is what's holding the lattice work of the bridge together. And the fact that our bridge is covered, that's what's helped it withstand the weather all of these years, so that we can still enjoy it today, which it is available for pedestrian access. It's been closed to vehicle traffic since I believe it was the late 70s when they opened the concrete bridge there. It is one of the oldest covered bridges that are left in the state of Georgia. We use it for festivals and gathering, education. It is a very popular place for photography and art and weddings and our heritage tourism. The next thing that we're known for is our Pioneer Cemetery. And this has come up in the last 25 years. The Pioneer Cemetery is located in the trees between the Presbyterian Cemetery and the Baptist Church there. And it was almost forgotten about. This is another example of why continued research is absolutely necessary. In the late 90s, the early 2000s, there was a push to actually build a parking lot between the two churches there, and there was individuals in the community that remembered that it was a cemetery for the enslaved individuals that were there, and they literally stood in front of the bulldozers and stopped that from happening and saved this. And they had someone come in with dowsing rods. If you're not familiar with that, it is where some people refer to that as divining rods, and walk the area, and they located over 333 graves are in there. Now, we have in recent time took ground penetrating radar through there on the pathways, because there's now pathways through there, and on the preliminary scans we can see it actually does confirm the dowsing rod locations of the graves. We do have a grant that we're going to be finishing out later on, hopefully this year, that will allow us to take the GPR through the rest of the cemetery, and we'll get a more accurate idea of the graves there and be able to mark them. But we have great support from the community with Euharlee Historical Society, Etowah Valley Historical Society, the City of Euharlee, Georgia Power. They help keep this site clean. And what this was an enslaved cemetery, not just before those two churches, but just for the community as well. Our churches there, during slavery, the members actually worshiped in the churches with their enslavers. And part of our research that we're doing right now is actually transcribing the historical church minutes for the Euharlee Presbyterian Church. That's one of the alternative sources that we've been looking for in order to find the names of the individuals, because for so long we've only known 3 individuals that were reported to have been buried there, which is Het Powell, her daughter Ada, and Jim Scott. All of the other 333 people are unknown. That's where the nameless no more. We would like to restore as many of the names and the history and the dignity back to these individuals that's been denied to them and their families for so many years. So we have been transcribing the historical church minutes and pulling names and researching those individuals. In the future, we will be releasing, we have been able to identify at least 2 more people that we're going to be able to about 95% sure are buried there in the cemetery. But as it says here, that new findings have emerged, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Oops. So the importance of this continued research. Many of the historical narratives that we have are incomplete, or they're being forgotten, they're not being passed down. A lot of the information that we have, which the information, a lot of it with the Pioneer Cemetery came from oral history, which is absolutely essential to get those oral histories written down, especially if there isn't a written record. That's all we have to go on. There's always some truth to the oral histories. There's always a grain of truth in there somewhere. But oral histories can also be like a game of telephone, where as it gets passed down, sometimes there's errors and things that get mixed up, or names or dates and places that are not correct. But with that continued research, we're able to go ahead and correct our histories. And it's not rewriting the history. It is making sure that we are presenting the history as accurate as possible, and we don't take this lightly either. We make sure there's as much evidence as possible that supports these changes before we put it out to the public, which is why we have waited on putting some of this information out that we're about to put out. And also, whenever you start to make these corrections, like I brought out here and earlier with the Euharlee covered bridge, for so many years, credit was being given to Horace King, which he is was a phenomenal man, and he should be celebrated for his accomplishments and everything. But the fact is, he died the year before our bridge was built. So how he built the bridge, we don't know. So Katie Goby, when she came to Euharlee, through her research, actually figured out that no, it was not Horace King that built it. It was his son Washington. And Washington was successful in his own right with his own family. And he deserves to be honored and given credit for that. And also that way we're teaching the accurate history. The similar thing with the Black Pioneer Cemetery, if somebody had not stood up and pushed for further research on that area, that site would have been totally lost. It would have been underneath a parking lot, which is sadly very, very common. There's several churches throughout Bartow County and throughout the United States where, unknowing to maybe the members of the church, there are graves underneath their parking lots. And a lot of time it's the African American community whose grave sites are underneath those parking lots, and they got forgotten about, and the records are just not there. So it's important to continue to research and protect these sites and these informations. So we're going to get to Het Powell. Our previous known history that we've been teaching for so long about Het Powell was that she was born in South Carolina and brought to Euharlee as a slave with her husband Johnson Powell and 3 of their 4 children. We've always said that she was a midwife in the community. Het Powell and her daughter Ada were 2 of the individuals I brought out earlier that is supposed to be buried in the Black Pioneer Cemetery. The other children have been thought to be Lee, Cora, Mary Ellen, and Gordon. And the story was Lee is that supposedly he was sold to another enslaver and Het never saw him again. That's our story that we got from past research and the oral history that was passed down. Well, our new findings suggest that Lee and Gordon may actually be the same person. So we don't think there's actually 2 sons. We think there's 1. And Ada is not actually Het's daughter. Ada is Het's granddaughter. We have found that out through research. In the 1870 census, Johnson is found in Bartow County with daughters Cora and Lou, but Het is not present in that census. And I have searched and searched and searched for Het, and I've yet to been able to locate her in Georgia. I have found a record that's actually in Virginia that could possibly be her, but It is not definitive, and I'm still further researching that to see if there's any way that we can determine for sure whether or not that is Het. So that gives us some uncertainty about whether Cora and Lou are actually Het's children or from a previous relationship that Johnson had, or maybe Het and Johnson were together at some point and separated. But by 1880, we see that Johnson and Het are together in Bartow County with their children Gordon and Ellen, which is also known as Mary Ellen. And Cora is actually listed as a farm laborer on the farm of Robert Cotton Powell. As I mentioned, we believe that Lee and Gordon may be the same person, as records list them both as their children. They have the same birth year. They're never listed together on the records, and Gordon's name never appears again after 1880. It's Lee after that point. And the death certificates for both Cora and Lee confirm that Johnson and Het were their parents. Whether it was adoption or biological, we don't know. The other thing, the story about Lee being sold to another enslaver and Het never seeing him again. Now, we cannot ever confirm or deny whether or not Het ever saw him again. But the fact is Lee was born after emancipation, so Lee was never enslaved. And Lee raised his family in Cassville, and so he lived in the community here. So that's something that we're correcting in our narrative and our history that we've been given. And this actually shows, it's the 1870 and the 1880 federal census that shows Johnson, Cora, and Lou living together. And then in 1880, we have Johnson and Het, which he's listed as Hetty on a lot of records, with Gordon and Ellen. And then you can see Cora down here as a hired farm laborer at the farm of Robert Cotton Powell. And it's very possible that Robert Cotton Powell is the former enslaver of Johnson Powell. These are the death certificates for Lee Powell and Cora Powell Godhigh. You can see here that he lists Johnson, or the person, Victoria, his wife, lists Johnson and Hetty or Het as his parents, and they said that they were born in Stylesboro, Georgia. But if you look at Cora, where she also lists Johnson and Hetty as her parents, she actually lists Het's birthplace as Virginia, which gives us a little bit of a clue to that might possibly the record that I've been looking at. And for the 1870, Het may actually be in Virginia at that point. And Lee is buried at Cassville Cemetery, and Cora was buried at Drummond Hill Cemetery out in Euharlee. Other findings. Now, Mary Ellen, this is actually from the bound records for Bartow County. This is a legal document that Het and Johnson signed that would bound their daughter to W.H. Baker until the age of 21. In this legal agreement, Baker pledged to house, clothe, provide medical care, educate, and teach Mary Ellen to read, as well as teaching her how to do light farm work, pick cotton, and domestic tasks. He swore, and it's written out in here, not to mistreat, misuse, or allow others to mistreat her. At the time, Mary Ellen was only 12 years old. So this actually was not an uncommon thing to happen if you read through the bound records, where it was a way for a family that might have possibly been struggling as well to have their children be taught a trade or skills and make sure that their basic necessities were taken care of. And even though the person promised to do all those things, it's really up to that person's moral code whether or not they actually went through with what they promised to do in there. And we can hope that Mary Ellen was treated the way that he promised. And we do know that she at least did get an education. So we're hoping that this person was an upstanding citizen and did treat her well, even though basically she was a hired hand is what. And she was trading education and skills for labor. Mary Ellen and her husband Beasley, later, this is where we know that there's definitely education was important to Mary Ellen, because they became one of the first families to host a school for African American children in their home in Euharlee. There was the Drummond Hill Church, which was destroyed, and then Corinth Church was built. Later on, the school that was hosted in their living room was actually moved to Corinth Church, that is located out on Cliff Nelson Road. Another thing, the oral history never talked about the fact that Het was married a second time. We've always known her as Het Powell. And even before I ever started working full-time at the museum, I was good friends with a descendant. It's a great-granddaughter of Het Powell. And she gave me permission and asked me to look in to Het Powell's family tree. So I have been researching Het Powell for about 6 or 7 years now and building out their family tree. And what always used to bother me is from 1880 to 1920, I could find records of Het except for 1910. I could never find her in 1910, which seemed weird because she was consistently in the records. So I started broadening my search and dropping the last name Powell and just searching for Het. Anybody named Het, Hetty, anything similar to that in the community. And I came up with a 1910 census that showed a Harry Sproul and a Het Sproul living in Euharlee. And I kept looking at the name. I went back and forth for a while thinking, well, that name seems really familiar, Harry Sproul. And what I realized was I had been seeing his name all along in all of the other census records that involved Het Powell. So for Johnson, her first husband, we only have the oral history and we have some census records that put them together. And we believe that Johnson passed between 1900 and 1904. With Harry, our research shows that Het married Harry within couple of years possibly, or it could have been immediately after Johnson's death, because they're married in 1900 and Het and Harry marry in 1904, which we actually do have a marriage record for Het and Harry for 1904. In the 1880 census, Harry Sproul is actually living in close proximity to the Powell family. He's actually listed right next to them in the census. So they at least knew or were in close proximity with each other from 1880. In 1900, Harry is actually listed as a boarder in the Powell household. So he is living with Johnson and Het in 1900. 1910, Het and Harry are listed as domestic servants in Dr. McGowan's home, and they live just two on the census record, 2 individuals or 2 houses away from her daughter Mary Ellen and Beasley God High. We do have Harry's death certificate as well. That's why in 1920, that's what was always confusing. 1920, she's listed as Het Powell again, and she's living in the home of her daughter. But what it was Harry was suffering from paralysis, and he was already in a hospital. He was in the county home in Floyd County, and that's where ultimately he passed away in 1922. 1920 census, Het is living with her daughter Cora and son-in-law John Godhigh, and we actually have the date of passing. Het died on October 27th, 1921. So for a long time we could only estimate her information on the memorial out there at the Pioneer Cemetery. The date is listed as 1900 because they couldn't find any records after 1900 at that point when that memorial was put up. But we know now that Het actually lived to an estimated age of 100 years old, and she died October 27th, 1921. She was still listed as married, and that was because her husband, Harry, was in the hospital or the county home in Floyd County. And interesting enough, it actually listed her occupation, which there can be errors on this because it all depends on the person who's reporting that information, that she was a cook all of her life and not a midwife. Now, that doesn't mean that she didn't act as a midwife as well, but actually the other night I saw an interesting at the thing the other night here, the book that had all the medical information in it. I was flipping through it and noticed under midwives there was a Maggie Godhigh, which is a descendant of Het's is listed as a midwife. So it's very, very possible that as these oral histories are passed down, that some of the information and the names get mixed up. And the oral history with Het, it was always said that she was buried in the Pioneer Cemetery because the family had been told, my grandmother is buried there, my great-grandmother is buried there. But according to her death certificate, which Dr. McGowan signed off on, she is not buried in the Pioneer Cemetery. She is buried at Drummond Hill, which actually makes a whole lot more sense that she would be buried at Drummond Hill, because the fact that they moved their place of worship, they were no longer forced to worship there in Euharlee, because during slavery, when they were enslaved, they didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice where they worshiped. It was either worship with your enslaver or not worship at all. And so it always confused me as to why they would continue to use an enslaved cemetery after the fact that they had already moved their place of worship to the Drummond Hill Church and established the Drummond Hill Cemetery. And all of Het's family, that the Drummond Hill is also known as the Good Cemetery and the Godhigh Cemetery, depending on who you ask. That's all her family. That's her children and her grandchildren. So to me, it makes much more sense that she is buried in Drummond Hill Cemetery. Now, could that be an error? Could she still be in the Pioneer Cemetery? It could be. But our records are pointing towards the fact that she is actually interred at Drummond Hill. And these are some of the census records where we can see Harry is highlighted. If you look below Harry on the top, and this is why I say we don't take these changes lightly and without evidence. There's Johnson and Het are listed underneath Harry. Johnson Sproul is living with Emily Susan Taylor Moody. She was a Sproul before. He is a hired farm laborer in the Moody and Sproul household at that time. That's the 1880 census. This one right here is the 1900 census. We can see Johnson and Het, and Harry Sproul is listed as a boarder. And then this is the 1910, where I found Harry and Het are living in the household of Dr. McGowan, and right here is her daughter and her son-in-law and their family. So this is the proof that we needed to make that tie, to find out why Het was missing, and to prove her second marriage as well. And we do have the marriage record for her marriage to Harry. And this is her death certificate that we found. And the reason we hadn't found it before is because she was listed as Hetty Sproul and not Het Powell. And you can see that it says that she was either cooking or cookery all life, and she was about 100. She died of old age, according to Dr. McGowan, which we can only all hope to live to 100 years old. And the undertaker is Stylesboro Supply Company, and it lists her as being buried at Drummond Hill. Our next individual that we're going to talk about is Millie Taylor. Millie Taylor is somebody that we've never spoke about before. Millie, we came across her name when we were transcribing the historical church minutes from the Euharlee Presbyterian Church. And you can see here at the bottom, this is an entry in the church minutes where it says, that's a colored woman of R. Spear, Millie, a woman of K.S. Taylor, and Harry, a man of R. Milam, closed with prayer. This was them being admitted into the church as members of the church. Millie was first documented as a servant, being enslaved by K.S. Taylor in this document that we have found so far. She was admitted to the church on October 16th, 1859. But by May of 1861, the church minutes record her being reproved for misconduct. She is the only one that I found that was listed being reproved for misconduct in the church minutes. And I wanted to find out more about this woman. The whole initiative with this research was to find the names of those that might be interred in the Pioneer Cemetery. And it's actually turned into two different projects. The projects of finding those that we can say are buried in the Pioneer Cemetery, but also discovering the names of the individuals that survived enslavement and where did they go in our community. Millie is one of those that, even though she ended up being ostracized from the church, she survived, and her descendants actually contributed majorly, not just to Euharlee, but to Bartow County. So she is suspended from the church in June of 1861, and records indicate that she probably had a child between 1861 and 62. So that could be, we can speculate that could have been the reason for her suspension, that maybe she had what they would have considered a child out of wedlock. But as soon as they were able to, Millie actually married William Bluford Cochran on October 30th, 1866. We have the marriage record for that. And by 1870, they're listed as living together with children Lee, Tallulah, and Melinda. Now, based on their ages, if Millie and William were together before they were actually legally married, they would have had their first child, Lee, around the age of 15. And this is the marriage certificate for Millie and William. It is kind of hard to read, but we're really blessed to have at least some of these documents to look back on. Now, Millie's legacy includes her children Lee, Tallulah, Melinda, Hilliard, and Florence. The one we're going to focus on today is actually Melinda. Melinda married William Henderson, and their children were Cora, Savannah, Maggie, and Pearl. There are other records. There's two different records that list that they had an adopted child, but on both records, the name and the sex of the child is different. So we don't know if that is two different individuals or they're just bad. Whoever was taking the census records, if they didn't know how to spell it, they'd write down whatever they thought on there. But we can see on here William, Melinda, Cora, Savannah, Maggie, Pearl, and then this was the adopted child in this record. The one that, as we move on, you might be familiar with the name is Maggie. This is going to be the contribution that we see to Bartow County. Maggie Henderson Knight married Frank Knight on August 1st, 1906. The Knight family might be familiar to some that have done the African American research here in the community. By 1930, Maggie, they're living in downtown Cartersville here. They're living on North Bartow Street. And Maggie is actually, she's listed as married. We're not sure where her husband was at that time, but she's living with her son, Willie, and it's listed that she owns her home. She's not renting it, she owns it. And by 1938, she's operating her own funeral home from her home, which not just for a woman at that time, but an African-American woman to be running a successful business is just an amazing feat. And not only was she running that business, then she continues to run it. She continues to be successful with it. And we can see in these two census records, we see Maggie Knight and her son Willie. And then in 1940, we see Maggie living there. And this is actually Bartow Street and North Bartow Street. So we can see that she stayed in the same location. Maggie Henderson Knight went on to, with her sons, to add a 24-hour ambulance service to theirs, which was not uncommon at that time for funeral homes to operate the funeral services. And they were one of the first ones in Bartow County to offer that service. The business was later renamed Knight & Son Funeral Home. And after Maggie's passing, it became Knight & Patton when they brought in a partner, James Patton, and was later sold and became Mack Eppinger Funeral Home, which still operates at 210 North Bartow Street today. So it is in the same area and location as where Maggie started it 87 years ago. And Maggie is a descendant of an enslaved woman that was ostracized and kicked out of the Presbyterian Church in Euharlee. This I don't know. I don't know how to put it in words without getting emotional, really, myself. When you look at these people who were forgotten about, like Millie Knight. She very easily could have been just completely lost to time. She's just one example of a woman who survived something that we cannot even fathom. We can't fathom being enslaved and not having the right to do as we please and to live our life. She lived through that. She survived that. And she went on to raise her family, and her descendants went on to not only live and stay in our community when they very easily could have moved away, but they lived here, they built here, and they thrived here. And this is just a very good example of a strong woman, a strong family whose legacy still survives and operates today, not in Euharlee, but in Bartow County. So moving forward, we are going to continue to research and document the names. We have numerous names that we're actually extracting from the church minutes from the Presbyterian Church that we are researching to see whether or not they are buried in the Pioneer Cemetery, but we're also researching if they survived that, where did they go in our community, and what are their contributions to Bartow County or wherever they ended up landing with their families, because we want to give them back and give their families back this history that has been deprived from them for so long, and to give them credit for the contributions, because none of our cities, Euharlee, Cartersville, anywhere, would be what they are without the contribution that those African American individuals, even when it was against their choice, it wasn't their own free will that they were enslaved. But we would not be where we are without their contributions, and that credit deserves to be given. And for too long, it has not. So we're going to work on continuing to restore the identities of the individuals in our area that we can give back that information to. We're also collaborating with the descendants of those that are buried in the Black Pioneer Cemetery and Drummond Hill Cemetery to honor their ancestors. We're advocating for the inclusion of Drummond Hill Cemetery and Mac Ebinger Funeral Home as a site on the African American Heritage Trail, which I've actually already sat down and talked with Alexis, and that is in the works to have those added to the African American Heritage Trail. We're also going to work on rededicating and expanding the memorial at the Black Pioneer Cemetery to include Drummond Hill. If you're not familiar with Drummond Hill is situated on 3 different pieces of private property. It's not easy to access, and unfortunately some of the burial sites are underneath a driveway now. So in order to do a memorial for those individuals and those families, it's incredibly difficult when you're dealing with the private property. So in collaboration with the city of Euharlee, and the descendants, we are working to combine the memorial to bring light to the Pioneer Cemetery and Drummond Hill. We want to continue to make sure that those 2 burial grounds and whatever else, because there are more burial grounds, not just in Euharlee, but throughout Bartow County that have been forgotten about, and we hope to continue to discover and uncover those and any records that might be left to be able to continue to share that and to strengthen our community involvement and awareness of the local African American history and the heritage that we have here. These are all the sources. If you have any questions about any of the research that was done or the records, we'll be happy to provide any of the research, any of the records for your research or your family or whoever would like to have access to this information. And that is it. So thank y'all for having me here. Thank y'all for being patient with me. This is not, like I said, my forte of speaking. This is probably the only 3rd time I've ever given a lecture. So thank y'all for being patient and listening to me. So. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Is the Drummond Hill, is it not an active church now?
No, the church that was there is not there anymore. The Drummond Hill Church, I'm not sure exactly the time frame, other than early 1900s that church was not used anymore. And that congregation is my understanding that is what Corinth Church is now on Cliff Nelson. So they moved from Drummond Hill to Corinth Church. And that is where, at that time, that is near the homestead of Dr. McGowan, and also where Mary Ellen and Beasley were living. So Mary Ellen and Beasley were hosting the school for the African American children. And when Corinth Church was built, which the story that I've been told on that, I think it was Dr. McGowan donated the land for Corinth Church to be built on. They moved the school to Corinth Church. But I don't know 100% why Drummond Hill was abandoned as the church site. We don't know that. So.
No church records then went to Corinth, Drummond Hill?
I am still reaching out to Corinth Church to see if anybody has any records that date back any further. Unfortunate thing, like a lot of church records, they get lost or somebody took them home. That's what happened. The reason that we're focusing on the Euharlee Presbyterian Church and not the Euharlee Baptist Church is the Euharlee Baptist Church had records that went way back, but somebody, thinking they were safekeeping the records, took them home and then they were destroyed in a fire. So we do not have anything, I think it's beyond or before 1900 roundabout for the Euharlee Baptist Church, even though it would be absolutely amazing if we found those records, because the earliest gravesite at the Euharlee Baptist Church is actually an 1818 burial. So we're missing a whole lot of history from that church by the destruction of those records. And we don't know if there's any surviving records from Drummond Hill.
What denomination was that church, or the Corinth Church? Were they?
I believe it's Baptist.
Oh, both of them?
I believe so.
Okay.
There's no marked graves at Drummond Hill at all?
I believe there's a few marked graves, but a lot of them are unmarked. There's actually, at the museum, we do have a historical survey that was done in 2008, I believe, by Carl Etheridge, who was also the one who did the survey for the Black Pioneer Cemetery. We do have that open to the public, so if anybody would like to take a look at the records for Drummond Hill, because the Drummond Hill was actually continued to be used for burial up until the 1970s, at least. It may be even beyond then.
And it's all private property now?
It is.
3 different owners?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
At least it was as of 2008.
Right.
It was 3 different private properties. Did you have a question?
So, could you explain, I don't think you mentioned where are you getting these Presbyterian records?
For the Presbyterian records, they were mentioned to, they were alluded to in, if you're familiar with the Euharlee history book, the Red Book, that's what everybody calls it. Miss Mary Ellen Taft alluded to those records, but we had no copies of those records. They were not in the church anymore, so I had to go on a search, because I did find a document that said from the Georgia State Archive requesting copies in the 1970s of those minutes. But when I contacted the Georgia State Archives, they no longer had those. And they referred me to the Presbyterian Historical Society in Pennsylvania to see if they had them, and luckily they did. The records had been sent to the Historical Society in Pennsylvania for the Presbytery, and the city of Euharlee actually paid to have them digitized, and they digitized them for us, and now we're in the process of transcribing those records, and that's where we're able to get the membership rolls. We do have in those church minutes, it lists the what they refer to as the colored members, and then it also lists some of their actually relationships, which is pretty amazing, because so in some of the entries it'll list their names and then say and the children of. So we actually have some of the mother's names and then their children listed, and we have the location where they came from. So the Euharlee Presbyterian Church was actually founded by about 5 families, and they all came from the same 2 churches in South Carolina. They came from Rocky Springs and what's the other one? It's another spring, but they came from the same 2 churches. These families picked up and moved out here, and they established their own church out in Euharlee. And so we can trace back. That's another step back that a lot of the history, when you're looking at the African American history, you don't know origin points. They get lost. Once you hit a certain point, there's that brick wall there. So thankfully, some of the records actually say where the individuals came from before they were in Euharlee. And there were actually members that joined that were African American even after emancipation and continued to worship in the church. Another thing that I didn't put on this that I just thought of, the history that we were always given with the Presbyterian Church was that there was a balcony for the enslaved members. According to the church minutes, which I was always very confused by that because I've been inside the church, I can't picture a balcony ever being in that church. But according to the records, they have it written in there that they actually designated the back 3 rows in the church, not a balcony. The back 3 rows were designated for the African American members of their congregation. So there's a lot of things that we're being able to correct and get more accurate history when it comes to not just the overall history of Euharlee, but the African American history and experience in Euharlee.
So, do you think Ada's probably not in the cemetery either?
I don't think so, because Ada was, I looked at her records this morning when I was doing a review for myself, and she passed away I think in the 1950s, 40s or 50s, so the likelihood of her being there, unless there was another offspring that was born in between the census years that we just don't know about, which is a possibility, I can't find any reason to believe that Ada would be buried there. And to go back to the oral history and what I mentioned earlier, some people don't pay any mind to the oral history, and some people put full credence on the oral histories that's passed down. And I really think we have to find that in between on there. So, because there is truth in the oral histories, I believe 100% that the descendants of Het Powell, when they were being told there was a grandmother that was buried in the Pioneer Cemetery, that there is a grandmother buried in the Pioneer Cemetery, maybe a great grandmother or a grandmother on the father's side or something like that. But it's not Het Powell. We just have the wrong name. So accurate story, most likely, but the wrong person is being attributed to the wrong person. Any other questions? Nope. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, baby. Sit down now.
Thank you, Dana. That was fascinating. Thank you for what you're doing to help preserve those stories in Euharlee and Bartow County. I'm glad you mentioned that about Euharlee Presbyterian Church. I was a member there for about 10 years in the early 2000s, and I'd always heard that story about the balcony. And
Right.
weird.
Right. It just doesn't look
It makes
like,
sense.
no.
Yeah.
But according to the records, it is noted the last 3 rows were what was
That
designated
makes
for
so
them.
much more sense.
It
The
does.
balcony and back of church maybe kind of got transferred somehow because they had such fancy handwriting.
Yeah.
That
I don't know.
everybody knows.
Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and we'll hope to see you again real soon.
Thank you for having me.